Hey everybody, thanks for joining me on this episode of Radio KBE. Today we're going to talk about the high motor big man, and this is a subject that I wanted to talk about when it comes to roster construction and just sort of needs that the Lakers sort of have as a team. Um, this season we obviously tried to make things work with DeAndre Jordan, and we tried to make things work with Dwight Howard, and it was something that sort of didn't work out in our favor. Obviously, DeAndre Jordan is pretty pretty much out the league. And one of the things that I think the Lakers probably lacked as a team was effort that they didn't get out of that position. For some reason, Dwight Howard was sort of uh, put in the doghouse for a while with uh, just kind of his play, and he was going through some off the court stuff, custody battles and stuff like that, and it seemed like he had some injury issues and whatnot. And so for this episode, what I really wanted to talk about was the importance of a high motor big man for the Lakers. And the feature image that you guys are looking at is Anthony Davis. And obviously one of the things that is sort of something that we wanted as fans out of Anthony Davis was him to play the five, and specifically we wanted him to be a very active five, especially with the addition of Russ. We wanted him to be more involved in pick and roll and more involved in just being more useful outside of just the post up stuff that he's been asked to do lately in the past 2 years. And obviously his health has been a pretty big concern, but things didn't necessarily work out in our favor. And I've sort of given it some thought, and I've also sort of thought about what's gone on with just this Laker team and what we're seeing in the playoffs, and the difference between what we see in the playoffs and what we see in the regular season. And one of the things that's just kind of stood out to me significantly, especially when the Lakers have played small ball lineups or just lineups where it's like a true floor spacing five, like when LeBron or Melo were going to the four, or even with Anthony Davis at the five, is the need for a higher motor out of our bigs. And by that, what I mean is big men or big wings that have a high activity rate. So it's not necessarily when we talk about wings and stuff like that, we've been talking about them, in regards to defense on the perimeter and switchability, that sort of thing, and just having more size. But I think one of the things that is really important that we haven't necessarily been kind of thinking about is the activity on the glass, the activity on the boards. And I think that's something that is important for the Lakers to be successful. I think it's important for any playoff team to be successful. So for this episode specifically, I wanted to talk about the high motor big man and how that player sort of plays into what we want out of that position, how that fits in with what the future Lakers scheme may be, and how we go about figuring out who the good high motor big men around the league that could potentially be available, whether it's through a trade or whether it's through free agency. And we'll take a look at the free agents that are available to see what we can find. And so before we get into that, I've come up with by looking through a few metrics. I've come up with a way to sort of figure out what's the best way to understand or to calculate, not necessarily calculate, but what metrics can you actually use? What advanced analytics can you actually use to figure out what a high motor big man actually is? Like there's no singular metric that says, hey, this guy has a high motor, this is exactly what he does, and if you grab this guy, this is exactly what you expect. It's almost it's an aggregation of a bunch of different metrics with different weights and stuff like that. So obviously I'm not going to create something like a LeBron score or a Raptor score or whatever fancy acronym that people now are using for the metrics. But there is data points out there. If you're able to figure out which ones accurately reflect what's happening on the floor, there are metrics out there that you can use that sort of help you understand what a high activity or a high motor big man is. And ultimately, I've been thinking about um, what the Lakers' future offense is probably going to be. I do think the Lakers are going to go in a direction, regardless of whether they keep Russ or not, where they're going to have a lot more not off ball movement, so not like the Warriors offense. What they're going to end up doing is I think they're going to try and find guys, especially with LeBron's health situation, try and find players that can participate more in pick and roll, participate more in DHO, use Anthony Davis for more than just running into, coming down the floor, posting up on the left block, and basically allowing teams to attack him defensively to his weaknesses. And one of the things that Anthony Davis we've sort of hoped that Anthony Davis would figure out, but he still had some struggle with is dealing with double teams in the post. And because of that, it's been hard for the Lakers to sort of transition from LeBron to Anthony Davis minutes where like LeBron is the feature guy to Anthony Davis being the feature guy, because they haven't necessarily been able to run the same type of offense. And playmaking wise, they've been trying to bridge the gap with Rajon Rondo, with Dennis Schroeder, and now Russell Westbrook. And that hasn't worked because the amount of salary that they're committing, the amount of salary they committed to Dennis Schroeder before he chose, before we chose not to re-sign him, and then obviously with Russ taking up so much salary cap space, we've aggregated up in salary, but it's not fixed the issue. And I think as fans, one of the things that we should just accept is that that's probably just going to be something that Anthony Davis struggles with. Not only is having a high motor big man beneficial to somebody like Anthony Davis, because they'll always be moving, actively cutting, making themselves available to be a threat. It also allows for the situations where LeBron isn't on the floor, but there is somebody like Russ or somebody else on the floor. It allows somebody else to run pick and roll actions, so teams can't just focus in on Anthony Davis even when pick and roll is being run, and it allows just a different look. And frankly, if we move, chances are we're probably going to move LeBron back to the 3 and Anthony Davis back to the 4, and we'll use them situationally as the 4 or 5, maybe at the end of games, very similar to what we did in the championship season. But the only way that can be successful is if the big man that we have has a high motor. And JaVale McGee was a player that we had during our championship season who played 5 to 7 minutes at the start of especially in the regular season, at the start of every half. And for whatever we thought of him in terms of his verticality and stuff like that, he did have a high motor. He would get up and down the floor. You've seen him do it with Phoenix in a bench role behind DeAndre Ayton, but he did have a high motor. And for somebody like Chris Paul, it's beneficial because Chris Paul is not able to get to the rim the way that he used to years ago because of his age and athleticism decline. So having a big man who's always routinely looking to screen, routinely diving to the basket in open space, making himself available, those are important things. That's something that helps offset some of the inability that the ball handler may have. When we think about Russ, one of the things that he had an issue with this past season was finishing at the rim. And so the Lakers thought, similar to what Mike D'Antoni thought with the Houston Rockets, that if I give you more space, it'll be easier for you to use your first step and attack the rim and get yourself an easy layup. And so it did work to some degree for the Lakers, but it was always situational. It worked at times against teams like Chicago. If you rewatch the games against Chicago, Russ didn't have any problem getting by Lonzo or Caruso or literally anybody that they put on him and getting to the rim. But the only reason that worked was because Vucevic wasn't a rim protector. What's happening now is really good defensive teams aren't allowing Russ to do that. What they would typically do, and they did this to Dennis Schroeder, is they would put a bigger player on Russ because Russ was his strength profile is like a wing. So even though Russ is a guard size, he's 6'3", 6'4", he's strong. And that's how he would bully guards that were the same size as him or smaller than him to the rim. So teams would immediately put wings on him, which were taller, longer, just as strong, to sort of negate some of the impact that he has with his first step. But at the same time, in case even if the wing was potentially going to get beat, there was always somebody, a secondary helper, a big man helping at the rim. And for the Lakers, when we went with Carmelo Anthony at the 5, or LeBron James at the 5, or even DeAndre Jordan at the 5, they were not like, either they'd be standing out in the perimeter, making it easier for teams just to rotate whenever they needed to, or it would be something like DeAndre Jordan, who really wasn't a rim, like a high motor big. He'd just kind of be waiting for the pass to come to him as opposed to making himself available. There was a small difference though. With Anthony Davis and Dwight Howard, they both did have, high motors when they played. So like Dwight, if you remember what happened in the season, there were a lot of missed connections between Russ and Dwight, because Dwight would dive to the rim. Russ's pass would be a little bit too hard or a little bit too fast, and it would slip out of Dwight's hands, or it would be behind Dwight. And obviously, Dwight's had some athleticism decline too as well, because of his back and just his age too as well. And so there were a lot of missed connections, but there were a lot of games where it actually worked out. One of the games where this particularly stood out was the Sixers game, where the Lakers played without Anthony Davis and LeBron, and it was at home. Dwight had a great game against Joel Embiid. The game was close all the way down to the wire, more or less, up until the last few minutes where the Sixers sort of pulled away. But you could see what was happening with the team. Same thing with, I think the Utah game is another good example of that. This is Dwight against Rudy Gobert. Like one's an MVP candidate, the other one's a Defensive Player of the Year candidate. Dwight had sensational games, and a lot of it was due to Russ attacking the rim, the ball moving around. And it's not just Russ; it was Malik Monk and Austin Reeves, other guys doing that, and finding Dwight, because he has an active motor. If there's anything that Dwight's always had throughout his entire career, is that he's always had an active motor. He's had a high motor when it comes to diving to the rim, and I think that's an element that the Lakers team really missed. It's an element that would have made a huge difference had we had somebody who was probably more young, a little bit more athletic throughout the entire course of the season. And so that's what the focus of this episode is sort of going to be, or this video is going to be, the high motor big man. And so there's three specific things that I think are really important for the Lakers to sort of tap into when it comes to just kind of looking, three qualities that they want to look at, that we want to think about when it comes to this. And so let me pull it up here. And so, rebounding motor is just something that I've already talked about. Like that's an incredibly important part of this entire equation. More often than not, when Anthony Davis gets put to the 5, what teams are trying to do is they're trying to draw him out to the perimeter so he can't help. And the thing that hurt the Lakers a lot this season was when he would get dragged away from the rim and put in a position where he couldn't help, teams could just basically attack with whoever they wanted. There was no concern about somebody coming over to help. Like Carmelo Anthony wasn't a defender like that, help defender. LeBron, he did in spots, but you can see how that sort of sapped some of his ability to play, some of his energy on the offensive end, or the potential risks to injury and whatnot. And so when we think about a high motor big man, and we think about how that person sort of fits in with everything that goes on, that high motor big man, you can use them in different ways offensively, but you can also use them to alleviate sort of the issues that you had with Anthony Davis being dragged away. And so when we had DeAndre Jordan in that situation, he would always sit in sort of like this semi-drop coverage. And so, the opposing team just sort of knew that they could just basically get a mid-range shot as easily as they wanted, and it wouldn't be any issue. The other issue was he wasn't grabbing rebounds the way you traditionally would grab rebounds. Like you think the ball hits the glass, somebody gets to the open space, grabs it. A good example of somebody who has a really, really good high rebounding motor that's in the playoffs right now is a guy like Kevon Looney. Like if we think of Kevon Looney, he's the player that, and I'm just going to write these names down here so it gives you sort of an idea of just kind of the guys that we can think about that we want to have sort of as a template of a high motor big man. Like when we think about rebounding motor, like Kevon Looney is a really good example. He's not the most athletic guy. He's not, the most physical guy, but he has a very good height. He has a very good IQ defensively, offensively. He moves to open areas so that he makes himself available within the Warrior system. But he does a really, really good job putting in effort when it comes to tipping out rebounds, just getting to open spots when he grabs to grab rebounds. It's just an effort thing. It's like almost being annoying. Like Looney does a really, really good job being annoying on the boards. And in that Memphis series, Looney, battling with Steven Adams and grabbing as many rebounds as he did in the closeout game was a big part of it because that allowed the Warriors to get additional opportunities, and if nothing else, to help them clean up the defensive glass. And when you have a Lakers team that has a guy like Malik Monk or Russ, or even guys like LeBron and AD who don't necessarily have they can't go from the perimeter, come all the way in, grab the rebound, then run out in transition. When you're trying to create small advantages, you have to have somebody dedicated in that manner. So when it comes to rebounding motor and stuff like that, like guys like Kevon Looney, guys like Steven Adams, those are guys that you're looking at to fill that very, very specific role. And it doesn't necessarily have to be for 35 minutes in the playoffs. You may use it a little bit more in the regular season. You may get them up to 24 to 30 minutes, but it's like a dedicated role, and it's something that takes some of the workload off of a guy like Anthony Davis, takes the workload off of a guy like LeBron James, and it allows them to just focus on other things and not have to worry about the small things, at least up until the playoffs come up. So you can see with like rebounding motor, like Looney and Adams are pretty good examples, and they can help change the course of a series or change the course of a game just with their activity in that regards. So moving the next sort of attribute that I wanted to look at, or that I look at when it comes to thinking about a high motor big man, is their activity frequency offensively. So typically when we think of big men, back in the day, we always thought about him like in terms of post-ups and making moves and all that sort of stuff. And obviously in the modern NBA, that's sort of changed. The Lakers didn't run very much of a pick and roll offense, and that's probably something, I don't know if it's because of Vogel, if it's direction because of the front office. I also don't know if it's because the star players wanted to play that way. It's hard to tell. But having your big man involved in the offense and like that frequency of involvement is really important. And we think about some of the offenses that constantly have their big man involved on almost every single possession. A team like the Jazz that always has Rudy Gobert set the screen as the very first action of what goes on in the NBA. The Warriors do this with Kevon Looney setting pin down screens, setting up flare screens for Clay and Steph, and now Jordan Poole. Think about a team like the Atlanta Hawks that uses Clint Capella in that fashion with Trae Young. There are a lot of teams out there that either have dynamic or don't have dynamic ball handlers, but still use a big man screen as a very first part of their action. And there was a lot of times in the Lakers just sort of season where they just came down the floor and they immediately went into a post up. Like they just set up Anthony Davis in the post, or Russ would come dribble all the way down, post up a guard. LeBron would do the same thing. He'd come down early and then get set up in the post. And there's no movement. There's no defensive player movement. It basically just allows the defense to come down the floor and set up the defense exactly the same way, exactly the same time. There's no change. And so getting a high motor big man allows the Lakers to sort of increase the amount of activity that happens on the offensive end. Even if it's like dummy action. Even if a pick and roll is just the first action you run, just to see how the defense challenges it, right? Dallas is another example, right? Dallas runs this with Dwight Powell. Like they'll come down and they'll run a pick and roll with Dwight Powell at the start of every possession. If for nothing else, just to see how the defense reacts to it, and then allows the ball handler to make their reads accordingly, whether it's attacking the rim, moving the ball to the other side of the court, whatever it may be. And like I said, you don't it doesn't mean that you have to go to the big man, but it's helpful. It gives you an option of doing something like that. And so when we think about another team in the playoffs that utilizes just sort of utilizes their big man in as part of their activity, another team that does is Miami. Like Bam Adebayo is, it's not like he's like this incredible offensive talent. Like he's a really really good. He can be a really good offensive player. But his role is to come down at times, set the screen for the ball handler, set the screen for Tyler Harrow, or set the screen for Duncan Robinson or Max Strus or Gabe Vincent. Just be involved in the offense in that manner, and that's a big part of any good offense. And again, that's just something the Lakers didn't have. How many possessions do you remember where DeAndre Jordan was coming down and immediately screening for Russ as the first action? It just wasn't happening. And it's the same thing. Towards the end of the season, we started seeing it more with Russ and Dwight. And again, that's just because Dwight was the guy, probably the lone guy on our team that has a high motor. Even when we played Wendy Gabriel at center at times, you could see it because he would come down the floor and he would screen every single time. The motor part it's a skill. And I know a lot of people will say, well, no, it's not a skill. It's not a basketball skill. It's just you have it in you and you don't. Players can learn to have a high motor, but the value of having a high motor has to be there, right? Like somebody at some point has to go to, you may not have to tell Steven Adams to keep crashing the glass. He understands that. But there may be times where Kevon Looney isn't crashing the glass, and you need to go tell him that. I'm not saying that that's what happens, but some players require that sort of thing, and some players have it innately. So it can be learned. And same thing with screening. Like just come down the floor, screen every single time. Some players will do it, some players won't, because there is a physicality to being, setting a screen, having to eat an elbow from a smaller player, just the repeated collisions over and over again. So you can already see that, like, when it comes to rebounding motor, when it comes to being involved in the offense and like the frequency of your activity, like those two things already sound exhausting. Like you're talking about having to crash the glass offensively, defensively, then you got to run all the way down the court and be the first person that's at the screen. That's not an easy task. And when we think about the way that the Lakers, Laker fans and the Lakers want to use Anthony Davis, you haven't seen it consistently, right? Obviously he's had injuries and stuff like that, but you can tell that it's taking a toll on him physically, right? Because he's not built like a traditional big guy. He's not built like Joel Embiid. And he doesn't have a very specialized role within the Lakers offense either, like maybe a Steven Adams or Kevon Looney would within their offense, within their teams. And so that's something that we have to consider. If we want to maximize Anthony Davis's ability on offense, and then his ability to take out entire plays defensively and stuff like that, just because of his length and his ability to play upside, similar to a guy like Giannis, you have to have a high motor big man. You got to have somebody there who's willing to do the dirty work or do the grunt work, right? Why do we call it grunt work? It's because nobody really wants to do it, so we try to give it to the grunts. And there are guys in the league out there, guys like JaVale McGee, who the Lakers were able, and Dwight Howard when we did have him the championship season, that were willing to do that kind of work. And having a high motor big man or having a grunt sort of be willing to do that and play that role for the Lakers is important, because I think it adds, it reduces the workload for it has a cascading effect on LeBron, it has a cascading effect on Anthony Davis and Russ if he's here, or whoever else is here, and that sort of thing. So rebounding motor is important, and then the activity frequency on the offensive end. Now, a big part of the activity frequency is what kind of offense we run. If we come down and we're running this triangle offense where we're just ISOing and posting up Anthony Davis and LeBron, I personally don't think that's going to be a successful offense, but we have to change. We have to have more pick and roll. We have to have more DHO, and that sort of stuff will be helpful. And there are data points for rebounding motor and for activity frequency that I've sort of collected. And so I'm not going to share it here because I'd like to say it's my sort of secret sauce of figuring out who's a good high motor big man. So I'm just giving you sort of like these general descriptors of what they are. But there are specific metrics that I look at, and then eventually when I share like the folks, and it won't be on this video, but eventually I'll share who I think would be good targets as a high motor big man for the Lakers. So you'll catch that eventually. But this is sort of the way that I think the direction the Lakers should go. And I don't know what the investment is. How much do you have to invest in a guy like that? But we'll take a look at the free agents that are available and what they may potentially cost in a bit. So the the third quality that I think is really important and this is a little bit more this is more important for the playoffs more than it is a regular season, but it's just the targeted frequency on defense. Like one of the things that I think hurt the Lakers a lot is those 20 games that we played DeAndre Jordan. Teams were going after DeAndre Jordan, like not dragging him out into the perimeter, but because of the coverage that he was playing, or because they knew that he's an older guy, he's not going to run around and stuff like that. Like he's not athletic the way they used to be. And same thing with Dwight, like because teams understood that look, his athleticism isn't necessarily there. They would attack him. And as a result, they would draw fouls or they get easy layups, or it would end up being a situation where they would get beat and, somebody on the Lakers would have to go help. And that, and then now, the rotations aren't good. Somebody gets a wide open three. When you have a big team and you have a team that has a lot of length, typically coaches are going to try and attack your foot speed. And so having good mobility out of that big man in that center position is really important. It's not mobility in the sense that you have to stay in front of the guy that's in front of you, right? Like I don't expect that the Lakers to find a center that can stay in front of Trae Young or stay in front of Steph Curry. It's nearly impossible to do something like that. It's just the physics of a 6'10" guy trying to stay in front of a 5'11", 6 foot guy who's just lower center of gravity. The first step is always going to come. It's a basketball thing, right? It's just not going to happen. But what you're looking for is in the data, try to find somebody or try to find big men who, when they do get targeted, do a decent job either forcing the ball to get passed away, or just defending a shot, whether it's chasing him from behind or whatever it is, or finding a big man that has a low rate of target, right? So a big man that doesn't get targeted as much because teams the scouting report is aware that player can move their feet, right? So one of the examples that we have and Boston actually has two examples that I wanted to share, is one of Al Horford and one of Rob Williams. Both of these guys, one of the reasons why Boston's defense has been successful is because teams, in theory, try to target them, but because Al Horford, even despite his age, a lot of it has to do with his IQ too as well, because of his ability to sort of move his feet, understand sort of the defensive game plan and stuff like that, because he's able to be prepared for situations where he may get called out in an ISO or something like that, he does a good job, and it's not as effective. And with Rob Williams, he's a young guy. He's athletic, he's tall, he can jump out the building, he understands how to use his length, how not to overplay chasing players. That sort of stuff is really important. And that allows Boston's defense to be that much more dangerous. And because it's more dangerous, they can do a lot more. They can create turnovers. They don't have to overhelp to each other and stuff like that. And those are just some things that are really important. This is really important for the defensive aspect of having a big man. It says the targeting frequency. You can find that in the data. But mobility is something that's very hard to find in data. But mobility is, I think, probably one of the most important things that you need out of a big man defensively. As much as we talk about having a high motor on the offensive end, mobility is really important on the defensive end, because teams will try to move the ball around. And having a mobile big man who has a high motor, who's willing to run around not on the perimeter, but maybe has to run from one end of a corner three to the other end of a corner three. Like that's a big deal. Like that's a lot of effort that requires a motor and a willingness to do it. And those are Horford and Williams are two examples of guys that are successful without having to downsize because they're able to play in both big lineups and small lineups. So these three qualities are the qualities that I think are most important. And so, like I said, I've found data points that sort of address each one of these metrics. But what I'd like to do, I won't share the numbers themselves, but what I like to do is just sort of take a look forward. So we have this framework of players that have been used in the playoffs this year. And in Looney, Adams, Powell, Adebayo, Horford, Williams, like some of these guys are role players. Some of these guys have gotten paid a lot of money. Some of these guys are up and coming guys and stuff like that. But they all essentially play a role as a high motor big man in their offenses and their defenses. So what's available for the Lakers? So just sort of looking at the free agents that we have right now, it's sort of sparse. There's not a lot of players that sort of qualify or fit into this category. Obviously, the Lakers have Anthony Davis, and we hope that he's sort of that guy when we need him to be. But we don't want him to do that full time just because of his injury issues. We don't want to risk him getting hurt, having to do this, and it is physically taxing. Also, LeBron playing the five should almost never happen. It should be a very situational thing at the very most. Maybe at the end of games or where there's a clear advantage to playing him at the five. But in reality, he should never play the five just because of how taxing he is. He's 37, 38 years old. It's not reasonable. So when we look around the league and we look at the unrestricted free agents, and you just kind of think about it, right? Just what qualities you need, right? You know what qualities you're looking for in a high motor big man. You want somebody who has a high rebounding motor, who is willingly going to get more involved in the offense as a screener, and who can move their feet defensively, right, on the defensive end, and how much they get targeted. We start looking down the list. Yusuf Nurkic has had some injury issues, but has a really good rebounding motor. He screens a lot. The Portland offense involves him in a screen all the time for Damian Lillard. So you've got two there, but he's probably not the guy who has the defensive mobility, or he probably will get targeted on the defensive end when it comes to that sort of thing. Serge Ibaka, he has a back injury. I really don't know where he's at when it comes to it. Thomas Bryant, another young guy, can move his feet. I'm not entirely sure where his rebounding motor is, but from his tenure with the Lakers and from what I've seen from the Wizards, he does screen. He's a pick and pop option. He has a good dive motor. He'll screen and roll to the rim. I'm not entirely sure where his finishing is at and stuff like that. But again, high motor, is active. I don't know how he is defensively in space, moving his feet, because I haven't watched too much tape on him. But again, somebody that's worth considering, somebody that can help out on the offensive end and do some of the grunt work. JaVale's going to be, JaVale's on a little bit on the older end. He's 34, but again, similar role to that he played for the Suns. He gets up and down the floor, makes himself available. He's willing to screen. He's willing to do all the grunt work when it comes to it. And if you just keep continuing down the list, you'll see Dwight Howard. Lakers probably, maybe not bring him back, depending on what his health looks like. Not as a starting role, but probably as a defensive, maybe a third center or a second center, just as insurance in case Anthony Davis gets hurt. Andre Drummond will be available again. I don't know if the Lakers are interested in reuniting with him, but has a high rebounding motor, will come down and screen, but he's awful at finishing layups and finishing plays unless it's a wide open dunk. In space, he's actually not terrible. He has good hands defensively and stuff like that. So, but his footwork is probably not that great in space. But again, you're looking for high motor, high activity, guys that are willing to do that sort of thing. Bismack, you've seen that with the Suns. He actually jumped JaVale on the depth chart, I think, towards the end of their series against who did the Suns play? Against Dallas, even though they ended up losing the series. He was another guy that they just grabbed off the street, and he just does his role over and over again for the however many minutes that they need out of him to spell DeAndre Ayton. Mitchell Robinson is somebody that's sort of interesting to me. I don't know where he falls into line for New York's plans moving forward, and I don't know what his market looks like. But from what I've seen out of him, he's a really good athlete. He comes down and screens a lot, finishes above the rim, and he actually is pretty mobile as a defensive big. He understands how to use his length. Played in Tom Thibodeau's offense, which involves accountability defensively and stuff like that. And so I think he's an intriguing prospect if he's looking for an opportunity to raise his profile. I don't know if the Knicks are planning on retaining him or if he's going to be too expensive for them or what the situation is going to be. So it is just interesting to know just sort of the idea of adding him is interesting to the Lakers. But again, I don't know what the cost would be. So with any of these guys, probably with the exception of Yusuf Nurkic, I don't know what the market's going to look like for a center. But for the Lakers, they don't have to spend a lot if they can find a guy who can be really, really good in his role. Damian Jones, another name the Lakers fans will be familiar with, that had a high activity motor. Offensively, would come down, was willing to screen. He's a little slim, so I don't know how much he's willing to come down and collide over and over again and set screens. But he's young; he's willing to do it, and so that's a big deal. We could see how much of a difference just adding Wenyen Gabriel was for the Lakers. He's not a true 7-footer. He's a very skinny player, but Wenyen had a high activity motor. He would be willing to do it, and that's just something that the Lakers didn't have. They didn't have enough energy guys or high motor guys that are willing to do that grunt work. So even if you continue going down the list, you have Robinson, you have Biyombo, you have Jones, you have Tristan Thompson. All of these guys, to some degree, have good motors when it comes to rebounding. And whether they're rim protectors or not, if you move Anthony Davis to that role where he's going to end up being the help side guy anyways, you may not need rim protection in the same manner that you did when you had, our championship season. Because the Lakers will, by adding a high motor big man to the starting lineup, will now just get bigger as a team. As opposed to playing LeBron at the 4 and Anthony Davis at the 5. If you go to LeBron at the 3, which is more his natural position, Anthony Davis at the 4, and then you add a high motor big man, now the team's just bigger. So teams may not necessarily attack the rim with the same frequency that they would have if they knew that they could just drag Anthony Davis away by getting a switch and stuff like that. And so, the goal of this at the end of it is to sort of try and figure out what the best fit is going to be for the Lakers. And we may not know because there are still moves to be made. And there's other variables like how much a person may cost, how much it may cost to bring a certain person back, or just what may end up being the style of offense that we run. But the importance of a high motor big man, I don't think can be understated. And as it relates to, regardless of whatever the offensive philosophy is, as it relates to keeping LeBron and Anthony Davis healthy, I think it's incredibly important. LeBron's injury, the ankle sprain was him running down to get a rebound. Like, if you have, like a high activity big man, maybe he doesn't have to do that as much. Same thing with Anthony Davis. Like, him turning his ankle was him running a pick and roll with Malik Monk and landing on Rudy Gobert's foot. Now, that doesn't mean somebody else couldn't have just done the same thing, but just the frequency of putting him in that position is something that the Lakers have to be aware of. The more you use your stars to do stuff, especially like the little things in an 82-game season, the higher the risk of injury. There are teams out there that have guys that do this sort of work, the grunt work, and they put their star players in positions to just score and roam defensively and just take care of their assignments. And if Russ is going to be on this team moving forward, or if we move off of him and get wings or get a Malcolm Brogdon, whoever's speculated to come here, like you need to have them do that kind of stuff. They have to be the ones that attack the rim. They have to be the ones that play make for the others. And it can't solely be LeBron and solely be Anthony Davis because of the risk of injury and just because of just the risk of taxing their bodies over the course of an 82-game season, whether you load manage them or not. And next season will be important for the Lakers. And obviously LeBron's mentioned that he wants to try and win another championship. And so I think in order for the Lakers to do that, they have to try and get a high motor big man. They need to get a guy who can play for 10 minutes each half and can be relied on to be aggressive on the boards on both ends. If they can protect the rim with without fouling and stuff like that, then that's great too as well. But be a willing screener, be willing to dive to the rim, be willing to set screens off ball for other players without being instructed to do so. And then it's just a player that's willing to take the challenge on of having to guard players in space and not have to sit and drop coverage all the time for no reason. And mix up different looks and take pride in their role. And so it'll be interesting to see what direction the Lakers go in. But one of the things, whether it's by trade or through free agency, I think the Lakers absolutely have to try and add to this team are not just one, but two high motor big men if they can. And it may just come in the form of somebody that we get, and then we have like Dwight, and then we add like Anthony Davis as like the most ideal option at the end of the games, similar to the championship season. But I think it is incredibly important. And in order for the Lakers to be successful, I think for them to get back to being a good defensive team and a much more dangerous offensive team, they need a player like that. And I know a lot of the conversation has been about shooting and putting shooting around LeBron, and that's fine. I think that's important too. But having a player or players that are willing to do that kind of grunt work, the stuff that there's no sexy highlights of people grabbing rebounds, but those sort of things matter, and it's what leads to winning basketball. And I think it's something that the Lakers got away with, moved away with, because they wanted to try to run a specific style of offense because they thought Anthony Davis could, consistently play that 5 position. Obviously, he was hurt, so that made an issue. But they have to respect the basketball value of having a high motor big man as part of your roster. And I'll be looking forward to seeing what direction they go in. And in a future episode, I'll make sure that I share just kind of my list of guys that may be available around the league that the Lakers should possibly target through a trade. We already went over the free agents. But it'll be interesting to see what direction they go in. So I appreciate you folks joining for this episode of Radio KBE. It'll be on YouTube if you enjoy it. Like, subscribe, share. I appreciate you joining me for this conversation. And I'll see you soon.